Councillor, ladies and gentlemen, please silence for Lady Antonia Fraser, your President, who will propose to toast the memory of the Sir Walter Scott.
Mr. Deputy Chairman, Mrs. Maxwell Scott, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin by reading you a passage which chills and horrifies me as much today as it did over 40 years ago when I first read it. In less than 2 minutes, Foster, who remained behind, heard the tread of a horse in the courtyard, and then a whistle similar to that which was the Earl's usual signal. The instant after, the door of the Countess's chamber opened, and in the same moment the trapdoor gave way. There was a rushing sound, a heavy fall, a faint groan, and all was over. At the same instant, Varney called in at the window in an accent and tone which was an indescribable mixture betwixt horror and raillery. "Is the bird caught? Is the deed done?" "O God, forgive us," replied Anthony Foster. "Why, thou fool," said Varney, "thy toil is ended and thy reward secure. Look down into the vault. What seest thou?" "I see only a heap of white clothes like a snowdrift," said Foster. "O God, she moves her arm. Hurl something down on her. Thy gold chest, Tony, it is a heavy one." "Varney, thou art an incarnate fiend," replied Foster. "There needs nothing more. She is gone." That, of course, is the hideous scene near the end of Kenilworth, when the Earl of Leicester's henchman, Varney, caused Amy Robsart to be murdered by falling through the oubliette, so that his master can successfully marry Queen Elizabeth. It is appropriate that, owing as I do an enormous debt to Sir Walter Scott, not only of pleasure but also, as I shall hope to show, of direct inspiration in most important ways, I should begin by acknowledging my debt to Kenilworth. For this was not only the first Scott which was read to me at a very tender age by my mother, but also the first Scott I read. This was because I found it quite impossible to wait for the nightly reading. So carried away was I by the character of the feckless, unhappy Amy Robsart. So convinced was I, knowing no history, that the Earl of Leicester must acknowledge her, there must be a happy ending, that when my mother was about halfway through, I decided to read on secretly myself. Cunningly leaving her beautiful Waverley copy intact, I went to the Oxford Public Library and sneakily read to the end, or rather until I got to this passage about Amy Robsart's death. Imagine my despair. Imagine, too, the fearful predicament in which I now found myself. Impossible to confess to my mother, who prided herself rightly on these reading aloud sessions, what I had done. Impossible, surely, to conceal my distress at what I now knew, being then as now no actress. And it was indeed impossible. For that evening, when my mother was in the midst of reading some merry scene of revelry and mirth at the court of Queen Elizabeth, I dissolved suddenly into loud tears, and eventually could be heard sobbing over and over again, "Poor, poor Amy Robsart! Poor, poor Amy Robsart!" Under the circumstances, I think you will all understand that my mother, no fool, flung down the book and cried, "I shall never read to you again." Dreadful as it was, and I remain feeling guilty to this day, I fear that the fact that I was now free to read as many Scots as I liked, out in the open as it were, more than compensated for my mother's fury. And so I began to devour the works of Sir Walter Scott. And so my eyes were able to look for themselves out of his magic casements. From then on, I read voraciously. Ivanhoe was next, I fancy, then Peveril of the Peak and the Talisman. The Abbot, with its moving evocation of Mary Queen of Scots, certainly. Woodstock, including 2 future subjects, the Protector Oliver Cromwell and the young Charles II. Oddly enough, as you will observe, I did not read at this period the great Scots, if I may so term them, the Scottish Scots, such as the Heart of Midlothian or Old Mortality. I was then a very English child, living in wartime Oxford, where my father was a Don, I think that was probably the reason. Luckily for me, I was to become, by my work, by my first marriage, a very Scottish adult, a Scot by adoption, perhaps, at any rate, the mother of 6 Scots, so that I was able to read these great works for the first time later, when I was of an age to appreciate them all the more. Even if I had not read the great Scots as a child, I had, by reading those I did, reading so many of them, and so avidly, with such excitement, been stamped forever with Sir Walter's mark. Just as the Jesuits claim to mark a child forever if they can educate him or her during the first 7 years of life, I was claimed by Sir Walter, and in a sense, learned history at Sir Walter's knee. I am confident, too, that Sir Walter himself would be happy to have provided that kind of inspiration. As he himself remarked on the subject, did not the great Duke of Marlborough once admit that Shakespeare's history plays were the only English history he knew? Might I not also serve the purpose of interesting people in history? Yet I do not mean by this, I hope, that I was fatally marked by Sir Walter's historical inaccuracies, or rather, those cases where Sir Walter improved upon history. I think sheer factual accuracy in every detail, so very important in a historian, of course, for what is the use of a false record, is really not the point with a historical novelist. To give an example in one of the books mentioned earlier, Charlotte, Countess of Derby, in Peveril of the Peak, is a fanatical Catholic in a story set at the time of the so-called Popish plot of Titus Oates in 1679. In fact, the point about the real Charlotte, Countess of Derby, was that she was a Protestant, a French Huguenot, in fact, and also, perhaps a mere detail, but rather important to a historian, she actually died 15 years before the Popish plot. No, what we seek and find in Scott's works is the vivid recreation of the past, not the solid biographical details. Having recently studied the career of Charlotte, Countess of Derby at length for a portrait of English women in the 17th century, I cannot claim that Scott provided me with any illumination in that respect. But he did provide illumination earlier, when I was studying the Popish plot for my biography of Charles II, and was obliged to contemplate the nature of fanaticism. Where Scott's accuracy is concerned, I am reminded of a comment made by the celebrated French critic Sainte-Beuve upon the works of Flaubert, himself, incidentally, a great admirer of Scott. In 1862, Flaubert sent Sainte-Beuve a copy of his historical novel about Carthage, Salammbô, on the eve of its publication. Flaubert added a note, by the way, which all authors on the eve of publication will find sympathetic. Now I have nothing further to do except discover printer's errors, mistakes in style, mistakes in grammar, etc. In short, undergo the usual humiliations, which, having a book, The Weaker Vessel, coming out in 2 months' time, I find these words particularly sympathetic and I hope not too prophetic. Sainte-Beuve, however, wrote in the margin of the letter, "Grammatical mistakes not very important. The essential is that a book should have life and interest, catch hold of the reader, bite him, be absorbingly real or magic." I particularly like that use of the word bite. That is what I think Sir Walter does in his recreation of history. He bites us. Then Sir Walter's narrative power provides of itself an important example for a would-be historian, not just because all books are the better for being readable, but for a particular historical reason. This is the care that the historian must take in avoiding hindsight. The dangers of hindsight being well summed up by F.W. Maitland when he wrote that historians must always bear in mind that what now lies in the past once lay in the future. Now, when Sir Walter Scott writes about the uprising of the Covenanters in Old Mortality, a tale in which, as he himself described it, 2 sets of cruel and bloody bigots, without the least idea either of toleration or humanity, oppose each other in ruthless conflict, and the moderate hero, Henry Morton, has to choose between them, We know the historical outcome of the story. The uprising of the Covenanters in 1679 ended in their decisive defeat at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge 3 weeks later. We do not know, however, the fate of Henry Morton the hero, whom the Covenanters condemned to death, even in the bitter hour of their defeat, for having urged peaceful negotiation and having released Lord Evandale on parole. Morton's last hour seems to have come as he is about to be executed, when, in a famous passage, the situation is reversed. Several of the party began to make ready their slaughter weapons for immediate execution, when Mucklewrate's hand was arrested by one of his companions. "Hist," he said, "I hear a distant noise." "It is the rushing of the brook over the pebbles," said one. "It is the sough of the wind among the bracken," said another. "It is the galloping of horse," said Morton to himself, his sense of hearing rendered acute by the dreadful situation in which he stood. "God grant they may come as my deliverers." And of course they do come as Morton's deliverers, Morton himself being finally spared by Claverhouse as a reward for his own mercy towards Evandale. Yet the excitement of that passage, the, at the time, uncertainty of the outcome, to be compared perhaps with the uncertainty of Sister Anne looking out of the window for deliverance for Bluebeard's unhappy bride, is something I think every historian should aim to convey. How much can one learn from Scott in that respect, even when narrating the best-known story? I believe that this rule concerning hindsight applies to biographers even more forcibly than to the wider practitioners in the field of history. For example, with regard to the life of Charles II, most readers will dimly suspect that the unhappy monarch does escape after the debacle at Worcester in September 1651. Otherwise, whatever happened to the Restoration? Nevertheless, in writing that thrilling adventure story, I felt it vitally important to remember the principles of Sir Walter Scott, to make the reader hear the sough of the wind and the rushing of the brook over the pebbles, to wonder whether the king would actually escape from his pursuers. Otherwise, there would be no true recreation of his character and, of course, of his courage at that particular moment. How mistaken it would have been to have written out all the excitement of the story, not only for narrative power, but also for historical truth. King Charles himself did not know how his story would end, and nor, in one sense, should we, the readers. The first thing I learnt at Sir Walter's knee was the importance of bite, and the second to beware of hindsight when writing narrative. The third thing, for which I may have been cursed by some of my readers, and even the great unknown may have been cursed once or twice for it too, which simply makes me believe I'm in good company, is the use of historical detail in description, so that the dullest inventory or monastic chronicle can be used to enrich the narrative. Those passages early on in Kenilworth concerning Amy's apartments, when my mother was still reading aloud to me, have a lot to answer for, and may explain some of the illuminating detail of the clothes of Mary Queen of Scots, of which I am proud, but over which some critics, but never incidentally readers, have groaned. I think the clothes of Mary Queen of Scots, as taken from her own inventories, are literally the stuff of history. Mary Queen of Scots made elaborate preparations for her marriage to Darnley, with 30 gorgeous new dresses ordered according to the inventories. For her subsequent marriage to Bothwell, she merely had one yellow dress relined with white taffeta, and another old black dress relined in black. This contrast, from one of the most clothes-conscious princesses in history till the present day, shows her relative attitude to the two gentlemen. Certainly my belief in detail I owe to Sir Walter's set pieces, such as the Kenilworth apartments. This is the banqueting room. The walls, lately so bare and ghastly, were now clothed with hangings of sky-blue velvet and silver. The chairs were of ebony, richly carved, with cushions corresponding to the hangings, and the place of the silver sconces which enlightened the antechamber was supplied by a huge chandelier of the same precious metal, The floor was covered with a Spanish footcloth or carpet on which flowers and fruits were represented in such glowing and natural colours that you hesitated to place the foot on such exquisite workmanship, and so on and so on. I found it intoxicating as a child, and I still find it intoxicating now. But yet, as admirers of Sir Walter know, there is a great deal more to him than the books. Sir Walter himself, as delineated in letters and anecdotes, in the many biographies, and above all in the Journal, that is an addition to the novels. The personality of Sir Walter, which emerges from the Journal, is in itself an inspiration to a historian. How delightful to find that Sir Walter began collecting relics so early in his life. To read that even as a law student, he filled his small den with association objects, including a collection of pieces of wood, fallen branches, brought from Falkland Palace and Holyrood, among others, from which he intended to have chessmen carved. I think there are few of us with a true love of the past who have not indulged in such a gesture and whose desks have not got cluttered over the years with association objects. Certainly this importance which Sir Walter paid to relics, his interest in them, symbolises for me his historical curiosity. A few years ago, when I had the privilege of making a television programme at Abbotsford, I think of all the fine objects there. The central glass case containing his antiquities was for me the most evocative. Scott was forever buying antiquities. He sent for them in great excitement out of catalogues so that they sound together like a roll call of popular Scottish history. A chair connected, as they say, with Sir William Wallace. Bonnie Prince Charlie's quaich. A ring with the hair of Charles I. A crucifix held by Mary Queen of Scots, a pocketbook worked by Flora MacDonald, Robert Burns's tumbler with lines cut by the poet in diamonds, a Douglas ring found at Hermitage Castle, which Sir Walter himself was fond of wearing, down to less immediately attractive souvenirs, such as a piece of oatcake found in the pocket of a Highlander on the field of Culloden. I am not suggesting, by the way, that there was anything falsely romantic in Scott's view of history. He also found it an important series for preserving Scottish historical documents, following the model of the Roxburgh Club, called the Bannatyne Club. Scottish history's debt to him is immense, but that collection is for me another example of the vividness which Sir Walter brought to the study of history, something from which we can all learn. A letter written only a few years before his death recalls the thoroughness of his own research. When he was young, how tirelessly he had pursued ancient ballads and documents. On the 1st of January, 1829, he wrote from Abbotsford to the Bishop of Llandaff, who had written to him suggesting a novel in a Welsh setting. Sir Walter explained at great length he could not do it, although even the very topic of Glendower has once or twice crossed my imagination. A chief British by birth and attachment, yet educated in all the accomplishments of normal chivalry. Nevertheless, if we have not a full and clear view of our subject, wrote Sir Walter, if we have not studied it in all its bearings, we may perhaps be able to sketch out an outline of a story, but I should doubt extremely the possibility of being able to colour it according to nature, so as to acquire that distinctive individuality which ought to distinguish so interesting a topic. In short, I need not tell your lordship, the bishop, sapere est principum et finis, which I need not tell you, Mr. Deputy Chairman, Mrs. Maxwell Scott, lords, ladies and gentlemen, means that knowledge is the beginning and the end. To me, these words, written in Sir Walter's own handwriting, which I read in a sale of manuscripts at Sotheby's late last year, are as moving as that first surreptitious reading of Kenilworth in Oxford Public Library more than 40 years ago. Sapere est principum et finis. That motto of Sir Walter's surely entitles him to be the patron saint of historical writing, and certainly mine. I have now great pleasure in proposing the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Ladies and gentlemen, the toast is the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Memory.